In 1922, a British archaeologist broke through a sealed doorway that had remained untouched for over 3,200 years. What he discovered inside would rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt's most mysterious boy king. Behind that door lay treasures so magnificent that they would captivate the world for generations. But more importantly, they held the key to understanding one of history's most enigmatic rulers. We're going to uncover the true story of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, and by the end of this video, you'll discover why his brief reign changed the course of Egyptian civilization forever. Before we dive into this incredible journey through ancient Egypt, I want to make a quick invitation. If you're new to the channel and want to follow more content like this, subscribe and click like to help the channel grow. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing quality content to you. Now, let's return to the fascinating world of the boy Pharaoh. Picture the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, where golden sand stretches endlessly under the scorching desert sun. Beneath this seemingly barren landscape lies one of humanity's greatest treasure troves, hidden for millennia. The year was 1323 before Christ when a young pharaoh, barely out of childhood, ruled over the most powerful empire on earth. Yet despite commanding legions of soldiers, controlling vast wealth, and being worshipped as a living god, Tutankhamun would die at just 19 years old, taking with him secrets that would puzzle historians for over 3,000 years. This is not just the story of a king who died young. This is the tale of a ruler who inherited a kingdom in chaos, attempted to heal a nation torn apart by religious revolution, and whose death may have been far from natural. The golden mask that made him famous worldwide represents only a fraction of his true legacy. Behind the glittering artifacts and priceless treasures lies a human drama filled with political intrigue, family betrayal, and mysteries that continue to challenge our understanding of one of history's greatest civilizations. What makes Tutankhamun's story so compelling is not just the incredible wealth found in his tomb, but the questions his life and death raise about power, mortality, and the price of ruling an empire. His reign coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in Egyptian history, when the old gods battled new beliefs, when traditional ways clashed with revolutionary ideas, and when the very foundation of pharaonic power faced unprecedented challenges. But to understand how a teenage pharaoh became one of history's most famous rulers, and why his tomb remained hidden while others were plundered, we must journey back to the magnificent yet treacherous world of the 18th dynasty, where royal bloodlines intertwined with divine destiny, and where young Tutankhamun would inherit far more than just a throne. The story of Tutankhamun begins not with his birth, but with the revolutionary upheaval that shattered Egypt decades before he drew his first breath. In the scorching heat of the 14th century before Christ, the mighty Egyptian empire stretched from the cataracts of Nubia in the south to the cedar forests of Lebanon in the north. For over 1,000 years, the pharaohs had ruled as living gods, their authority unquestioned, their divine connection to the afterlife absolute. But then came Akhenaten, a pharaoh who would challenge everything his ancestors had built. Akhenaten was not content to simply rule Egypt. He wanted to remake it entirely. Around 1353 before Christ, this revolutionary king abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes, rejected the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods that had sustained the empire for millennia, and declared that only one god deserved worship: the Aten, represented by the life-giving disk of the sun. He moved his court to a brand new city called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, built in the middle of the desert as a testament to his radical vision. The old priests watched in horror as their temples were closed, their statues defaced, and their ancient rituals banned. The name of Ammonius, king of the gods, was chiseled out of monuments throughout the empire. Trade routes that had enriched Egypt for centuries began to falter as Akhenaten became increasingly obsessed with his religious revolution, neglecting the practical matters of governing a vast empire. Vassal states in Syria and Palestine, sensing weakness, began to rebel. Egypt's enemies pressed their advantages while the pharaoh composed hymns to his sun god. Into this world of chaos and transformation, a boy was born who would eventually be called Tutankhamun, though his original name was Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten. The exact identity of his parents remains one of ancient Egypt's greatest mysteries, but most scholars believe he was the son of Akhenaten himself, possibly by a minor wife or concubine. Some evidence suggests his mother might have been Kia, one of Akhenaten's beloved secondary wives, though DNA analysis has complicated this picture without providing definitive answers. What we do know is that young Tutankhaten grew up in the artificial paradise of Akhetaten, surrounded by revolutionary art that depicted the royal family in unprecedented intimacy and naturalism. Unlike the formal idealized portraits of previous pharaohs, Akhenaten's artists showed him kissing his wife Nefertiti, playing with his daughters, and even relaxing in casual poses. This was a royal court unlike any in Egyptian history, where traditional protocol gave way to revolutionary ideology. But revolution, even divine revolution, cannot sustain itself forever. By 1336 before Christ, Akhenaten had died under mysterious circumstances, possibly assassinated by those who opposed his radical changes. His immediate successor, a shadowy figure named Smenkhare, ruled for only a brief period before he too vanished from history. The great experiment of Akhenaten was crumbling, and the traditional priests and nobles who had been marginalized for nearly 2 decades saw their opportunity to reclaim power. Enter Tutankhamun, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old when he ascended to the throne of Egypt. He was little more than a child, thrust into the most powerful position on earth at a time when his empire was fracturing from within and threatened from without. The boy king found himself at the center of a struggle between the old ways and the new, between those who wished to continue his father's revolution and those determined to restore Egypt's ancient traditions. The young pharaoh was not alone in facing these impossible challenges. Behind him stood some of the most powerful figures in Egyptian politics, men who would shape his reign and possibly determine his fate. Chief among these was I, an elderly courtier who had served under Akhenaten and who now claimed the role of regent and advisor to the boy king. I was a master politician, skilled in the art of survival in the treacherous world of royal court intrigue. Some scholars believe he might have been Tutankhamun's grandfather, though his exact relationship to the royal family remains debated. Equally important was Horemheb, a general who commanded Egypt's armies and who had watched with growing alarm as the empire's military strength declined during Akhenaten's reign. Horemheb represented the old military elite, men who valued strength, tradition, and Egypt's dominance over its neighbors more than religious innovation. He had served loyally under Akhenaten despite disagreeing with the pharaoh's policies, but now he saw an opportunity to restore Egypt's martial glory. The most influential figure in young Tutankhamun's early reign, however, may have been his wife, Ankhesenamun. Originally named Ankhesenamun, she was one of Akhenaten's daughters, making her either Tutankhamun's sister or half-sister, a marriage arrangement that would have been perfectly normal in royal Egyptian society. Despite her youth, she possessed the bloodline and political connections that legitimized Tutankhamun's claim to the throne. Their marriage was both a love match and a political necessity, binding together the fractured royal family in the aftermath of Akhenaten's death. Together, these figures formed a council of regency that would guide the boy pharaoh through the most crucial decisions of his reign. But their conflicting interests and ambitions would also create the tensions and conflicts that would define Tutankhamun's rule and possibly lead to his premature death. As the young king settled into power, the weight of his inheritance became clear. Egypt's treasury, though still vast, had been depleted by Akhenaten's building projects and neglect of profitable trade relationships. The priesthoods, long the backbone of Egyptian administration, remained hostile and suspicious. Foreign enemies sensed weakness and pressed their attacks on Egypt's borders. Most critically, the people of Egypt, from noble to peasant, yearned for a return to the stability and prosperity they associated with the old gods and old ways. The first and most symbolic act of Tutankhamun's counter-revolution came within the first year of his reign. In a ceremony that must have sent shockwaves throughout the empire, the young pharaoh formally changed his name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. This was not merely a cosmetic change. It was a declaration of war against his father's legacy and a promise to restore the old gods to their rightful place. The transformation extended far beyond royal nomenclature. Tutankhamun ordered the abandonment of Akhenaten, the revolutionary capital his father had built in the desert. Within months, the royal court packed up the accumulated wealth and administrative apparatus of the empire and began the journey back to Thebes, the ancient seat of pharaonic power. The move was both practical and deeply symbolic, representing a rejection of Akhenaten's isolation and a return to the traditional centers of Egyptian civilization. As the royal procession wound its way along the Nile, past fields of barley and wheat that had sustained Egypt for millennia, the young pharaoh could see the extent of his inheritance. Villages that had once prospered under the protection of local temples now struggled as those same temples lay abandoned or defunded. Irrigation systems, the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, had fallen into disrepair as attention and resources were diverted to Akhenaten's religious projects. The empire that had once been the envy of the ancient world showed signs of decline and neglect. Upon arriving in Thebes, Tutankhamun faced his most crucial challenge: winning back the loyalty of the powerful priesthood of Ammonius. These men controlled not only the spiritual life of Egypt but also vast economic resources, including land, livestock, and trade networks that stretched across the known world. For nearly 20 years, they had been marginalized, their god declared false, their influence systematically dismantled. Now they held the key to the young pharaoh's success or failure. The high priest of Ammonius, a man whose name has been lost to history but whose influence shaped Egypt's destiny, received the boy king in the great temple of Karnak. The meeting, though unrecorded in detail, must have been fraught with tension and possibility. Here was a child seeking to undo the work of his father, appealing to men who had every reason to distrust the royal family. Yet Tutankhamun possessed something his father had never offered: genuine repentance and a willingness to restore what had been taken away. The negotiations that followed would reshape Egypt's religious and political landscape. Tutankhamun promised not only to restore the traditional gods, but to fund the rebuilding and expansion of their temples on a scale that would dwarf even the grandest projects of his ancestors. Gold from Nubia, tribute from vassal states, and the accumulated wealth of the royal treasury would flow into massive construction projects designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's devotion to the old ways. But restoration came with a price that extended far beyond economics. The young pharaoh found himself caught between competing factions, each seeking to influence his decisions for their own benefit. His aging advisor, pushed for gradual change that would preserve stability while slowly undoing Akhenaten's revolution. Hormheb, the general, demanded immediate and decisive action to restore Egypt's military prestige and expand its borders. The priests wanted not just restoration but revenge against those who had supported the heretic pharaoh. Managing these competing interests required political skills that few adults possessed, let alone a teenager who had been raised in the artificial environment of Akhenaten. Tutankhamun relied heavily on his advisors, but he also began to show signs of the intelligence and determination that would characterize his brief reign. He learned to balance competing demands, to promise much while delivering enough to keep all factions satisfied, and to project an image of divine authority that belied his youth. The young pharaoh's marriage to Ankhesenamun provided both personal happiness and political stability during these turbulent times. Contemporary art depicts them as a loving couple, shown together in intimate poses that echo the naturalistic style pioneered during Akhenaten's reign but adapted to promote more traditional royal imagery. Their relationship represented hope for dynastic continuity and the possibility of healing the wounds left by the religious revolution. Yet even as Tutankhamun worked to restore Egypt's traditional order, the empire faced external threats that demanded immediate attention. The Hittites, Egypt's greatest rivals, had taken advantage of Egyptian weakness to expand their influence in Syria and Palestine. Nubian tribes, long held in check by Egyptian military might, began to test the borders in the south. Trade routes that had enriched Egypt for centuries were disrupted by bandits and rebels who sensed opportunity in the empire's internal divisions. General Hormheb pressed the young pharaoh to authorize military campaigns that would restore Egyptian prestige and secure the empire's borders. These campaigns, though costly in both gold and lives, achieved significant success. Egyptian armies, reinvigorated by renewed royal support and traditional religious backing, pushed back against foreign encroachment and restored order to trade routes. The victories provided Tutankhamun with the military credibility essential for any pharaoh and demonstrated that Egypt remained a formidable power despite its internal upheavals. As his reign progressed, Tutankhamun began to emerge from the shadow of his advisors and assert his own vision for Egypt's future. He initiated building projects that combined traditional Egyptian architectural principles with artistic innovations developed during his father's reign. The result was a distinctive style that honored the past while incorporating the best elements of Akhenaten's cultural revolution. But what nobody expected was that the young pharaoh's growing independence and confidence would soon put him on a collision course with the very men who had helped him restore Egypt's traditional order, setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine not only his fate but the future of the Egyptian empire itself. By the 7th year of Tutankhamun's reign, the boy who had once needed guidance for every decision had transformed into a confident young ruler with his own vision for Egypt's future. At 19 years old, he no longer resembled the frightened child who had inherited a fractured empire. His voice carried authority in the council chambers, his presence commanded respect in the temples, and his decisions reflected a growing independence that both impressed and alarmed his advisors. The transformation had not gone unnoticed by and Hormheb, the two men who had effectively ruled Egypt from behind the throne during Tutankhamun's early years. What had begun as a convenient arrangement, with a malleable child pharaoh serving as their puppet, had evolved into something far more complicated. The young king was developing ideas of his own, ideas that sometimes conflicted with the careful political balance his advisors had worked so hard to maintain. The first serious crack in their relationship appeared during discussions about Egypt's relationship with the Hittite Empire. For decades, these two superpowers had engaged in a complex dance of diplomacy and warfare, fighting for control over the wealthy city-states of Syria and Palestine. Hormheb, ever the military strategist, favored an aggressive approach that would decisively crush Hittite influence in the region. I, the master politician, preferred diplomatic solutions that would achieve Egyptian goals without the enormous costs of prolonged warfare. Tutankhamun surprised both advisors by proposing a third option: a comprehensive peace treaty that would establish permanent borders and create lasting stability in the region. The young pharaoh had been studying the reports from Egypt's spies and diplomats, and he had reached a conclusion that challenged conventional wisdom. Egypt and the Hittites were exhausting themselves in an endless cycle of conflict, while smaller powers grew stronger by avoiding such costly confrontations. The proposal sparked heated debates in the royal council. Hormheb argued that peace with the Hittites would be seen as weakness, encouraging other enemies to test Egypt's resolve. I worried that abandoning Egypt's traditional aggressive stance would undermine the pharaoh's authority and provide ammunition for domestic critics. But Tutankhamun had done his homework, presenting detailed analyses of Egypt's economic situation and the long-term costs of continued warfare. The young pharaoh's arguments revealed a sophisticated understanding of statecraft that neither advisor had expected. He pointed out that Egypt's military campaigns, while successful in the short term, were draining the treasury and preventing investment in infrastructure projects that would strengthen the kingdom from within. He noted that constant warfare disrupted trade routes, reducing the tribute and commercial taxes that funded the government. Most importantly, he argued that a stable peace would allow Egypt to focus on internal development and innovation. This was not the reasoning of a puppet ruler echoing his advisor's words, but the independent analysis of a king who had been quietly studying the challenges facing his empire. The realization sent shockwaves through the established power structure of the Egyptian court. If Tutankhamun could think for himself about foreign policy, what other areas of governance might he seek to control? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Tutankhamun announced his intention to personally oversee the construction of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, breaking with the tradition of leaving such arrangements to trusted advisors. More significantly, he declared that the tomb would incorporate revolutionary design elements that reflected his unique position as a pharaoh who had bridged the gap between his father's innovations and Egypt's ancient traditions. The young pharaoh's vision for his eternal resting place was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted. He wanted chambers that would tell the complete story of his reign, with artwork that depicted both his restoration of the traditional gods and his appreciation for the artistic advances made during Akhenaten's period. He planned to include revolutionary burial goods that would demonstrate Egypt's technological and artistic supremacy to anyone who might discover the tomb in the distant future. But the tomb project revealed something even more significant about Tutankhamun's evolving worldview. He had begun to think seriously about his legacy and his place in Egyptian history. Unlike his advisors, who focused on immediate political and military concerns, the young pharaoh was considering how future generations would remember his reign. This long-term perspective influenced all his major decisions and marked him as a ruler of unusual depth and vision. I and Hormheb watched these developments with growing unease. The political system they had constructed depended on their continued influence over the pharaoh's decision-making process. A truly independent Tutankhamun threatened to upset carefully negotiated agreements with various factions within Egyptian society. More personally, both men had their own ambitions for the future, ambitions that required maintaining their positions of power and influence. The situation became more complex when Tutankhamun began making changes to the composition of his inner circle. He promoted younger officials who had demonstrated competence and loyalty to positions traditionally reserved for established courtiers. He sought advice from scholars and artists who offered fresh perspectives on Egypt's challenges. Most controversially, he began consulting directly with provincial governors and military commanders, bypassing the traditional hierarchy that had channeled all information through his senior advisors. These changes reflected Tutankhamun's growing confidence in his own judgment, but they also represented a direct challenge to the established order. I, in particular, felt his influence waning as the young pharaoh relied less on his counsel and more on his own analysis of situations. The elderly advisor, who had survived multiple regime changes through his political acumen, recognized the signs of a ruler preparing to govern without guidance. The confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted during a meeting about Egypt's religious policies. Tutankhamun proposed modifications to the restoration program that would have reduced the political power of certain priesthoods while increasing their religious authority. The plan was sophisticated and showed deep understanding of the complex relationship between religious and temporal power in Egyptian society. It also would have significantly reduced I's influence, since much of his power derived from his relationships with key religious leaders. For the first time in their long relationship, I directly contradicted the pharaoh in front of the full council. He argued that the proposed changes were premature and potentially dangerous, given the delicate balance that had been achieved after years of careful negotiation. Hormheb supported I, adding that religious instability could provide opportunities for Egypt's enemies to exploit internal divisions. Tutankhamun's response revealed how much he had matured during his years on the throne. Rather than backing down in the face of opposition from his most trusted advisors, he calmly defended his proposal with detailed arguments and supporting evidence. He demonstrated that he had consulted widely before reaching his conclusions and that he understood the potential risks as well as the benefits of his plan. Most importantly, he made it clear that he intended to proceed regardless of their objections. The meeting ended in an uncomfortable stalemate, with neither side willing to compromise. But the underlying issue had been exposed for all to see. Tutankhamun was no longer content to serve as a figurehead while others made the real decisions about Egypt's future. He intended to rule as well as reign, and he possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to make that intention a reality. In the days following the confrontation, rumors began circulating throughout the royal court about tensions between the pharaoh and his advisors. Some courtiers sensed opportunity in the developing conflict, positioning themselves to benefit from potential changes in the power structure. Others worried about the stability implications of a public dispute between Egypt's most powerful figures. The situation was further complicated by external pressures that demanded immediate attention. Reports arrived of renewed Hittite activity along Egypt's northern borders, apparently testing the kingdom's response to potential provocations. Nubian tribes in the south had been emboldened by Egypt's internal focus and were conducting increasingly bold raids against Egyptian settlements. Pirates in the Mediterranean were disrupting trade routes that Egypt depended on for both wealth and strategic materials. These challenges required coordinated responses that depended on cooperation between the pharaoh and his military and diplomatic advisors. But the growing personal animosity between Tutankhamun and his senior counselors threatened to paralyze Egypt's ability to respond effectively to external threats. The young pharaoh found himself facing the most difficult period of his reign, with enemies abroad sensing weakness and allies at home questioning his judgment. The crisis reached its peak when reports arrived that a coalition of Nubian tribes had launched a major offensive against Egyptian garrisons in the south, while simultaneously, Hittite forces had begun massing near the Egyptian border in Syria. For the first time since his restoration of traditional Egyptian policies, Tutankhamun faced the possibility of fighting a war on two fronts, a scenario that could drain Egypt's resources and potentially threaten the stability of his rule. In this moment of supreme crisis, the fundamental question of who truly controlled Egypt would finally be answered. Would the young pharaoh defer to his experienced advisors and allow them to manage the emergency, or would he assert his authority and take personal command of Egypt's response? The decision he made would determine not only the immediate fate of his empire but also whether he would live to see his 20th birthday. However, what was about to happen would surpass all expectations and reveal secrets that had remained hidden for millennia, when an archaeological discovery would forever change our understanding of the young pharaoh's tragic end and the true circumstances behind his premature death. The winter of 1323 before Christ would prove to be the last of Tutankhamun's short life, though neither he nor anyone in his court could have anticipated the tragic events that were about to unfold. As Egypt faced the unprecedented challenge of simultaneous threats from both north and south, the young pharaoh made a decision that would seal his fate and create one of history's greatest archaeological mysteries. Against the vehement objections of both I and Hormheb, Tutankhamun announced his intention to personally lead the Egyptian army against the Nubian coalition threatening the southern borders. This was not merely a symbolic gesture designed to boost military morale. The young pharaoh intended to take active command of the campaign, making strategic decisions and potentially engaging in actual combat. For a ruler who had never before left the relative safety of the Egyptian heartland, this represented an enormous risk. The decision shocked everyone who knew him. I pleaded with the pharaoh to reconsider, arguing that his death in battle would plunge Egypt into chaos and potentially end the 18th dynasty. Hormheb, despite his military background, also opposed the plan, insisting that an experienced general should lead the campaign while the pharaoh remained in Memphis to coordinate the overall response to Egypt's multiple threats. Even Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's beloved wife, begged him to abandon what she saw as a reckless adventure. But Tutankhamun had made up his mind, and his reasoning revealed the depth of his political understanding. He recognized that his authority as pharaoh depended not just on divine sanction but also on the perception of strength and competence among Egypt's military elite. By personally leading a successful campaign, he would demonstrate that he was no longer the puppet of his advisors but a true warrior king in the tradition of his greatest predecessors. The symbolic value of such a victory would strengthen his position in all future confrontations with domestic rivals. The military preparations revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Tutankhamun's Egypt. The army that assembled for the Nubian campaign was magnificently equipped, with bronze weapons that gleamed in the desert sun and chariots adorned with gold and precious stones. Egyptian soldiers wore armor that combined protection with artistic beauty, and their officers carried staffs of authority that proclaimed Egypt's wealth and sophistication to any who might witness their passage. Yet beneath this impressive exterior lay troubling signs of the empire's underlying problems. Many of the soldiers were recent recruits with limited combat experience, as Egypt's best veterans had been stationed along the Syrian border to counter the Hittite threat. The logistics of supporting a large army in the harsh environment of Nubia stretched Egypt's resources to their limits. Most concerning, the divided leadership that had emerged from the conflict between Tutankhamun and his advisors created confusion about command structures and strategic priorities. The campaign began promisingly enough. Egyptian forces, moving swiftly up the Nile, achieved several early victories against isolated Nubian settlements. The young pharaoh proved surprisingly capable in his new role, demonstrating tactical skills that impressed even skeptical veterans. His presence among the troops boosted morale and reinforced the loyalty of soldiers who had begun to question their allegiance during the recent political turmoil in Memphis. But success in minor skirmishes did not prepare the Egyptians for the major confrontation that awaited them deeper in Nubian territory. The coalition of tribes had assembled a formidable force and had chosen their battleground carefully, selecting a site where Egypt's advantages in chariots and organized formations would be minimized. When the two armies finally met, the battle that followed would become one of the most significant military engagements of Tutankhamun's reign. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage for most of the day. Tutankhamun, mounted in his war chariot and protected by his personal guard, moved constantly along the Egyptian lines, rallying his troops and directing tactical adjustments. Contemporary accounts, fragmentary though they are, suggest that the young pharaoh showed remarkable courage under fire and demonstrated the kind of battlefield leadership that had made his ancestors legendary. But warfare, especially in the brutal conditions of the Nubian desert, does not respect courage or royal blood. As the battle reached its climax, with Egyptian forces finally beginning to gain the upper hand, disaster struck the pharaoh's chariot. Whether through enemy action, mechanical failure, or simple accident, Tutankhamun's chariot overturned at high speed, throwing the young king to the ground with tremendous force. The immediate aftermath of the accident was chaotic. Egyptian forces, seeing their pharaoh fall, wavered between continuing the attack and rushing to his aid. The Nubians, sensing opportunity, launched a desperate counterattack that threatened to turn Egyptian victory into catastrophic defeat. Only the quick thinking of experienced officers and the fierce loyalty of Tutankhamun's personal guard prevented complete disaster. Tutankhamun survived the initial crash, but his injuries were severe. Modern forensic analysis of his mummy, conducted using advanced CT scanning and other sophisticated techniques, has revealed the extent of the trauma he suffered. His skull showed evidence of a massive blow that likely caused severe brain injury. His ribs were broken, suggesting internal injuries that would have been fatal even with modern medical care. Most telling, his left leg was completely shattered, an injury that would have caused excruciating pain and massive blood loss. The young pharaoh was evacuated from the battlefield and transported back toward Egypt, but his condition deteriorated rapidly during the journey. The primitive medical knowledge of the time could do nothing to address injuries of such severity. Within days of the accident, possibly within hours, Tutankhamun was dead. His brief reign ended at the age of 19 by a combination of royal ambition and cruel fate. The news of the pharaoh's death sent shockwaves throughout the Egyptian empire. Ay and Horemheb, despite their recent conflicts with the young king, recognized the catastrophic implications of his death. Egypt faced not only external threats but also a succession crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. Tutankhamun had died without a clear heir, and the question of who would succeed him threatened to plunge the empire into civil war. In this moment of supreme crisis, the two most powerful men in Egypt put aside their personal differences and worked together to manage the transition of power. But their cooperation came at a price that would have profound implications for how Tutankhamun would be remembered by history. In their haste to stabilize the political situation, they made decisions about the young pharaoh's burial that would create mysteries lasting for over 3 millennia. The most significant of these decisions concerned the location and scale of Tutankhamun's tomb. Originally, as we learned earlier, the young pharaoh had planned an elaborate burial complex that would rival the greatest monuments of his predecessors. But his sudden death left these plans incomplete, and the political crisis that followed his demise demanded immediate action rather than lengthy preparation. Now serving as pharaoh himself after a hasty marriage to Ankhesenamun that legitimized his claim to the throne, ordered that Tutankhamun be buried in a smaller, hastily prepared tomb in the Valley of the Kings. This tomb, designated KV-62 by modern archaeologists, was originally intended for a lesser member of the royal family. Its cramped chambers and relatively modest decorations reflected the urgent circumstances of its use rather than the grand vision Tutankhamun had planned for his eternal resting place. Yet the very haste that diminished the tomb's architectural grandeur may have been responsible for preserving its contents for posterity. Unlike the elaborate burial complexes of other pharaohs, which attracted grave robbers throughout antiquity, Tutankhamun's modest tomb was overlooked and forgotten. The entrance was buried under debris from later construction projects, and its location was lost to memory within a few generations of the young pharaoh's death. This accidental preservation would prove to be Tutankhamun's greatest gift to future generations. When Howard Carter broke through the sealed doorway of KV-62 in 1922, he discovered not just the burial goods of a single pharaoh but a complete snapshot of Egyptian royal culture at its height. The golden mask that has become Tutankhamun's most famous artifact was just one of over 5,000 objects found within the tomb's chambers, each one providing insights into the beliefs, technologies, and artistic achievements of ancient Egypt. But perhaps the most important revelation from the tomb concerned the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death itself. The forensic evidence preserved within his mummy, combined with the historical context we have reconstructed from other sources, tells the story of a young ruler whose independence and ambition ultimately led to his destruction. The broken bones and traumatic injuries visible in his remains provide silent testimony to the violent end of a reign that had shown such promise. Modern science has allowed us to understand not just how Tutankhamun died, but also why his death had such profound implications for Egyptian history. DNA analysis has confirmed many details about his family relationships while raising new questions about the genetic factors that may have contributed to his physical frailty. Chemical analysis of materials found in his tomb has revealed information about trade relationships and technological capabilities that were previously unknown. The story of Tutankhamun's discovery and the scientific analysis of his remains represents one of archaeology's greatest triumphs, demonstrating how modern techniques can breathe new life into ancient mysteries. From CT scans that reveal hidden injuries to chemical analysis that traces the origins of burial goods, each new scientific advance has added another piece to the puzzle of the young pharaoh's remarkable life and tragic death. Yet, for all our scientific sophistication, the fundamental questions raised by Tutankhamun's story remain as compelling today as they were in 1922. What might this brilliant young ruler have accomplished if he had lived to reach full maturity? How different would Egyptian and world history have been if his innovative approaches to diplomacy and governance had been allowed to develop? And what lessons does his story hold for leaders in any age who must balance personal ambition with political reality? The answers to these questions may forever remain beyond our reach, but the search for understanding continues to drive new research and new discoveries that gradually fill in the details of Tutankhamun's remarkable story and its lasting impact on our understanding of one of history's greatest civilizations. The story of Tutankhamun stands as one of history's most compelling paradoxes. A pharaoh who ruled for barely a decade yet became more famous than kings who reigned for generations. Through the golden artifacts that filled his tomb and the scientific revelations that continue to emerge from his mummy, we have come to understand that his brief life encapsulated both the glory and the tragedy of ancient Egypt at its pinnacle. What makes Tutankhamun's legacy so enduring is not simply the treasure that surrounded him in death, but the human drama that defined his life. Here was a child thrust into impossible circumstances, who grew into a young man of remarkable vision and courage, only to see his ambitions cut short by the very boldness that might have made him great. His transformation from puppet ruler to independent leader represents one of the most dramatic coming-of-age stories in all of recorded history. The archaeological evidence tells us that Tutankhamun died violently, his body bearing the marks of catastrophic trauma that ended his life in an instant. But the historical evidence reveals something far more profound. He died as he had chosen to live in his final years, refusing to accept the limitations others sought to impose upon him. His decision to personally lead the Nubian campaign, despite its obvious risks, reflected the same independent spirit that had driven him to challenge his advisors and chart his own course for Egypt's future. In many ways, Tutankhamun's story mirrors themes that resonate across cultures and centuries. The struggle between youth and experience, the tension between innovation and tradition, the price of independence, and the fragility of even the most exalted human ambitions. These universal elements help explain why a pharaoh who died over 3,000 years ago continues to captivate audiences around the world. The scientific advances that have allowed us to peer into Tutankhamun's tomb and examine his remains with unprecedented precision have also revealed the sophistication of the civilization he represented. The craftsmanship of his burial goods, the complexity of his mummification, and the elaborate beliefs about the afterlife that his tomb represents demonstrate that ancient Egypt achieved levels of artistic and technological excellence that remained unmatched for millennia. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from Tutankhamun's story lies not in what he accomplished, but in what he represented: the eternal human desire to leave a lasting mark on the world. His carefully planned tomb, with its revolutionary design elements and comprehensive burial goods, was intended to ensure that future generations would remember and honor his reign. In a sense that he could never have anticipated, that goal has been achieved beyond his wildest dreams. The boy who became pharaoh at age 9 and died at 19 has achieved a form of immortality that even he, with his belief in the Egyptian afterlife, might not have imagined. Through museum exhibitions, scientific studies, and popular fascination that shows no signs of diminishing, Tutankhamun continues to serve as an ambassador for ancient Egyptian civilization, introducing millions of people to the wonders of a culture that flourished when much of the world remained in darkness. Modern Egypt, struggling with its own challenges of leadership, development, and national identity, has found in Tutankhamun a symbol of the country's glorious past and its potential for future greatness. The young pharaoh who tried to heal the divisions in his ancient kingdom has become a unifying figure for a modern nation seeking to reclaim its place among the great powers of the world. But perhaps most remarkably, Tutankhamun's story continues to evolve as new discoveries and scientific techniques reveal additional details about his life and death. Each CT scan, each DNA analysis, each chemical test of his burial goods adds another piece to the puzzle of who he was and what he achieved. In death, he has become the subject of investigations far more thorough than any he could have ordered during his lifetime. The golden mask that has become his icon represents far more than royal wealth or artistic achievement. It symbolizes the eternal human quest for meaning, significance, and remembrance that transcends the boundaries of time, culture, and mortality. When we look into those serene features, crafted with such skill over 3 millennia ago, we see not just an ancient pharaoh but a reflection of our own hopes and ambitions. Tutankhamun's greatest achievement may be that he has made ancient Egypt accessible and relevant to modern audiences in ways that no amount of scholarly research could accomplish alone. Through his story, millions of people have discovered the richness of Egyptian civilization, the complexity of ancient politics, and the timeless nature of human ambition and tragedy. Stories like Tutankhamun's remind us that the past is not a distant, irrelevant antiquity but a living part of our shared human heritage. Every artifact recovered from his tomb, every scientific revelation about his life and death, connects us more deeply to the long chain of human experience that links our modern world to the ancient civilizations that laid the foundations for everything we have achieved. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now, hit that like button, and share in the comments what fascinates you most about Tutankhamun's story. Was it his rise from puppet king to independent ruler, the mystery surrounding his death, or the incredible preservation of his tomb that has allowed us to piece together his remarkable life? Until the next video.